Welcome to the Quiet Hours. You can get new episodes a week early and ad-free by becoming a subscriber. Just follow the links in the episode description. Before we begin, let's make sure you're comfortable. Find a position that feels easy, lying down or resting somewhere soft. Let your hands fall loosely by your sides. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it gently for a moment, and then let it go through your mouth. Again, breathe in slow and deep, and out even slower. With each breath, let your shoulders soften, your jaw unclench, your thoughts drift a little farther away. There's no need to do anything now, no plans to make, no messages to answer. This is a time for stillness, just you, the sound of your own breathing, and the gentle space of this story. Imagine the air around you growing quieter. Imagine a faint scent of salt, a distant hush of waves. You're standing at the edge of an island where the sea sighs against the shore and the last light glimmers over calm water. This is Clara's story, a woman who listens to the sea and begins finding messages hidden in glass bottles that wash ashore. It's a story about connection and gentleness, about how even the quietest exchanges can change us. Let the pace of the story match your breathing. Let it draw you toward rest, the way the tide draws the sand. And if, as you listen, your eyes begin to close, that's perfectly fine. The story will carry on without you, as gentle and endless as the sea itself. The island was small enough that Clara could walk around it in a single afternoon, though she never had. She liked to imagine that somewhere beyond the bend of the western shore, the sand went on forever, unbroken, untouched. It was a kind of comfort, knowing there were corners she hadn't reached. Her house stood just above the tide line, its wooden porch bleached pale by years of wind and salt. In the mornings, she liked to sit there with a mug of tea, her feet tucked beneath a blanket, and watch the first light slide over the water. The sea never looked the same twice. Some days it was pewter and glassy. Others it came alive with blues so deep they felt like breathing. Clara had come to the island half a year ago, though time there didn't move in ordinary ways. Days softened into one another, marked only by the tide's slow rhythm and the hum of weather through the grasses. She'd grown used to quiet, the kind that fills the air rather than empties it. The locals, few as they were, had accepted her gently. The ferryman always tipped his cap when she collected her mail, and the woman who ran the small shop by the quay sometimes left fresh bread on her porch when storms kept the ferry from running. But for the most part, Clara kept her company with the sound of the sea and the scratch of her pen. She wrote, not stories anymore, not the kind that had deadlines or readers, but small notes to herself, observations, impressions, single sentences that felt like pebbles smoothed by handling. The sea is restless but kind today. A heron stood unmoving for almost an hour. Silence has texture. It was the morning after a storm that she found the first bottle. The night before, wind had swept across the island, shaking the shutters and bending the grasses flat. The sea had boomed against the rocks, its voice deeper and more insistent than usual. But by dawn, the sky had cleared into that washed silver calm that follows a good rain. Clara put on her boots and went down to the shore, as she always did after storms, to see what the sea had decided to leave behind. The beach was strewn with gifts, driftwood, ribbons of seaweed, shells still holding the scent of salt. And there, half buried near the edge of the water, was a small glass bottle. At first, she thought it was just debris, an old jar washed loose from a fishing boat, but something about its neatness caught her eye. The cork was still tight, sealed with a strip of wax. Inside, folded small, was a piece of paper. Clara turned it over in her hands. The glass was cool, the water inside the bottle glimmering faintly in the morning light. She hesitated, smiling at her own hesitation. It felt strange, opening something that had clearly belonged to someone else, even if that someone had cast it into the sea. She carried it back up to her porch, set it on the table beside her mug, and sat for a long moment watching the light catch the glass. Then with careful fingers, she broke the seal and drew out the note. The paper was thin, sea-damp, but legible, written in tidy black ink, only a few lines. The sea changes its mind every hour, but never stops speaking. I wonder if anyone listens. M. Clara read it twice, then a third time, more slowly. There was no date, no location, no hint of who M might be, just that thought, sent adrift. She leaned back in her chair, the breeze stirring her hair, the scent of salt and wet wood in the air. It had the feeling of something rare, something both random and meant. The note didn't ask for a reply. Still, she folded it carefully and set it on her windowsill, where the morning sun caught the edges. The sea, out beyond the line of foam, moved with its usual patience, as if now that the storm had passed, it was pretending nothing had happened at all. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm listening," she murmured. The days slipped by softly after that first bottle. Clara kept the note on her windowsill, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Sometimes, while she was writing or reading, her eyes would drift to it, the little square of paper lit gold by the afternoon sun. It gave her a feeling not unlike the hush that comes before a rain shower, the sense that something had begun quietly without asking permission. A week later, she found another. It was early morning again, the tide halfway out. The beach was smooth except for a scatter of kelp and the faint track of gulls. From a distance, she saw the glint of glass among the stones. The bottle was smaller this time, its cork darkened with salt. Inside, another folded page. She carried it home before opening it, the sand still clinging to her boots, the air sharp with the scent of tideweed. Sitting at her small kitchen table, she unrolled the damp paper. There's a place where the horizon folds like paper when the sun sets. I watch it each evening, but it never looks quite the same twice. That was all. Clara traced the letters with her thumb. The handwriting was the same, steady, deliberate, with small curls at the ends of words. There was no clue as to where these bottles came from, how far they had traveled, or who had taken the trouble to write them. She began to look forward to her walks more than she wanted to admit. Each morning she followed the same path down from the dunes to the water's edge, eyes scanning the shoreline for the faint glimmer of glass, Some days there was nothing, and she'd simply stand with her hands in her pockets, breathing the salt air. But every so often another bottle appeared, tucked among the seaweed or resting shyly near a rock pool. Each message was short. Sometimes it was a single thought. The wind changes before the gulls do. Or a question. Do you think the sea remembers? There were never any instructions, never any hint of who M might be. But the tone, that quiet mix of curiosity and calm, began to feel familiar, almost companionable. One evening, sitting by her porch with a candle burning low, Clara took a sheet of her own paper and began to write, not to anyone in particular. At least that's what she told herself. The sea doesn't forget. It carries everything somewhere, just not always where we expect. I think maybe that's how we learn to let go. See. She folded the page carefully, slipped it into an empty bottle she'd washed clean, and sealed it with a cork and a little melted wax from her candle. The tide was rising. She could hear it whispering just beyond the porch. Carrying the bottle down to the shore, she waited until the water reached her ankles, cool and gentle. Then she bent, let the current take it from her hands, and watched as it drifted out, the flame of sunset glancing off its curved side. It bobbed twice, then turned, carried steadily toward the darkening horizon. Clara stood there until she couldn't tell which ripple was hers anymore. That night, she dreamed of waves that whispered in words she almost understood. When she woke, the world was quiet again. The only sound was the sea outside her window, soft, endless, and for the first time in a long while, something like a friend. By late summer, the bottles had become part of the landscape, as natural to her as the gulls that traced slow loops above the dunes, or the soft creak of her porch boards in the wind. Clara no longer searched for them with quite the same intent. She simply walked, and every so often, the sea left one for her to find. It was a rhythm, not a hunt. Sometimes days passed without a sign, the tide sweeping in and out with its old patient breath. She'd spend those mornings in the garden, trimming the rosemary that grew wild along the path, or sitting by her window with a cup of tea cooling beside her notebook. The world had grown smaller, but in a way that felt tender, like holding a shell and finding the sound of the whole ocean inside. When a bottle did appear, it always seemed to do so quietly, as though the sea had placed it there when she wasn't looking. She'd spot it half buried in sand, the sunlight glancing off its side, and feel that faint lift in her chest. Surprise softened by familiarity. She never opened them right away anymore. She liked to bring them home first, set them beside her on the table while she made lunch or folded laundry. There was a small pleasure in waiting, in letting curiosity steep a little before tasting it. Each letter from M carried its own small world. There's a calm that comes before the fog, when even the birds seem to hold their breath. Some days, I think the sea is trying to tell a story it can't quite remember. A sail passed this morning, white as silence. They were fragments, really, but each one left an echo. Sometimes Clara read them aloud, her voice quiet under the sound of the surf. There was comfort in the thought that someone, somewhere, was writing to the same rhythm, that two people could speak across the water without needing to see one another's faces. And so her replies became part of that tide too. Not every time, just when something in the day seemed to ask for an answer. Yes, the fog here smells of rain and cedar. It blurs the world into something kind. The sea's memory might be longer than ours, but I think we remember in different ways. You write it down. I walk it off. A sail passed here too. Perhaps it was the same one circling between our shores. She began to notice how her own handwriting changed. Slower, rounder, more deliberate. Her words were less guarded now, less like someone reporting a fact, and more like someone sharing the shape of a thought. And when she wasn't writing, she found herself listening differently. The sea's moods became a kind of language she could almost read. The low hum of a calm morning, the gentle fret of incoming weather, the hush of low tide when the sand lay bare and shining. It wasn't that the island had grown more alive. It was that she had begun to meet it halfway. Sometimes she imagined M as an old man sitting on another shore, ink-stained fingers and a thermos beside him. Other times she thought of M as a woman like herself, alone but not lonely. And occasionally she liked not knowing at all. Mystery had its own kind of kindness. Weeks folded into one another like the pages of a book. By the time autumn edged across the island, Clara's window ledge was lined with bottles. Some still held their notes, others she'd emptied and washed, their glass catching the afternoon light like captured sky. On quiet evenings, she'd light a candle and watch the flicker play across them. Tiny lighthouses made of memory and glass. One evening, as the first geese began to travel south, she stood on the shore holding a new letter. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke. "You write as though you know the sea personally. I think you do." That was all it said. Clara smiled, the corners of her mouth soft with warmth. "I don't know it," she wrote back that night, "but it's teaching me how to listen." She sealed the letter, walked barefoot through the sand, and waited until the tide was high enough to take it. The bottle slipped from her hands with the ease of habit and drifted outward, caught by the moon's slow pull. Above her, the stars appeared one by one, the same way the letters had arrived over these past months. Quietly, with purpose, and just when she needed them most. She stood until the bottle became a glimmer, then a shadow, then nothing at all. The sea whispered at her feet, steady and endless. Clara whispered back, as if the tide might carry her voice all the way to M. "Good night." By the time autumn had settled across the island, the mornings had taken on a cooler light. The air was sharp with the smell of kelp and wood smoke. The dunes shivered with the dry rustle of pale grasses. Even the sea seemed slower now, as though it too had begun to turn inward. Clara found herself waking earlier, not out of habit, but because the dawns were so quiet she didn't want to miss them. She would wrap a shawl around her shoulders and step out onto the porch with her tea steaming in the half-light. The world at that hour felt unguarded, all the edges softened by mist. The letters still came, though less often now. The currents must have shifted, or perhaps M had grown occupied elsewhere. Each arrival felt like a small mercy, a voice carried across the water, reminding her that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone else was looking out at the same restless expanse. One note arrived tucked inside a bottle streaked with salt and sand, the cork half loosened by its journey. The air smells of apples here now. The evenings fall quicker. I've begun to light a lamp when I write. The flame shakes when the wind presses against the window. There was something intimate in those words, something different from the easy observations of summer. It wasn't sadness exactly, but a kind of quiet honesty, the kind that comes only when nights grow long. Clara found herself reading it several times before setting it down. That evening she lit her own lamp as though to answer. The flame trembled faintly, caught in the same breath of wind that had found M's window. "The lamp flickers here, too," she wrote back. "I think the sea is trying to remind us how light behaves in the dark." She smiled as she wrote it, though she wasn't sure whether it was a comfort or a truth. The ferries grew less frequent as the season cooled. Fewer tourists, fewer deliveries. Sometimes, when the weather turned rough, the island felt almost entirely her own, the shop shutters drawn, the paths empty except for gull tracks. She began baking more, filling her kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and bread. She'd hum while she kneaded the dough, her voice mingling with the sigh of the wind through the eaves. And sometimes, when the sea was too wild to walk beside, she'd sit by the fire reading old letters or recopying fragments from M's notes into her journal, as if to preserve their warmth before the cold truly set in. A few of M's more recent letters hinted at something heavier, though never directly. "The nights are longer than they used to be, or perhaps it's just that I notice them more now. I've been walking along the shore and finding pieces of driftwood I can't remember losing." There were pauses between those letters, weeks, sometimes more. Clara tried not to worry, telling herself the sea was simply slower now, that the current needed time. Still, she found her gaze drifting more often toward the horizon, as if her looking alone might coax the next bottle into being. Then, one cold morning near the end of October, she found one wedged between two rocks at the far end of the cove, the place where the tide broke hardest. The bottle was scratched and cloudy from the journey, the paper inside faintly stained with salt. The first frost arrived last night. It covered the window glass like lace. I watched it melt in the morning sun and thought about impermanence, about how nothing really stays, but some things return in another form. I hope the sea is kind where you are. Clara held the letter for a long time before she folded it away. Later that day, she walked to the northern cliffs, the wind tugging at her coat. The water below was dark, restless. She thought about impermanence, how even the bottles that survived the journey might one day sink, their messages dissolving into silt. And yet, the words still existed in the air between her and M, carried in memory if nowhere else. When she returned home, she sat by the fire and began to write. The sea is kind today, the kind that listens. I think about what you said, about things returning in another form. Maybe that's what the tide is. Maybe that's what we are too. She sealed the note, her fingers lingering on the warm wax before setting the bottle gently in a shallow tide pool at dusk. The water caught it and began to draw it outward, slow and sure. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the windows of her little house. She lay awake, listening to the rhythm of waves against the shore, that steady conversation between sea and sand. Somewhere out beyond the dark, her message was drifting. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Winter came to the island not with snow, but with wind. It moved through the grasses and rattled the shutters, carried the scent of salt into every room. The days grew shorter, the mornings pale and blue. When Clara walked the beach, her breath rose in clouds, and her boots left clean tracks across the frost-hardened sand. The bottles stopped arriving for a while. She told herself it was the weather, the storms, the currents too rough for such fragile things to find their way ashore. But still, each time she walked down to the water, her eyes searched, not expecting exactly, but hoping. The silence wasn't an emptiness. It was something else, a pause, maybe, the kind of quiet that comes when the sea draws back before a larger wave. One morning, after a week of hard wind, Clara woke to a stillness so complete it seemed to hum. The air had changed. The sky was a pale gray, the sea smooth as glass, as if the whole world had stopped to take a breath. She made tea, wrapped herself in a thick sweater, and stepped out to the porch. The sand below was littered with debris from the storm. Shells, seaweed, broken branches. And there, glinting faintly in the washed light, was a bottle. It was larger than any of the others, its glass frosted and worn. The cork was wedged deep, the seal broken. She carried it inside, wiped the salt from its sides, and eased the note free. The paper was damp, edges curled. She laid it flat by the stove until it softened, then began to read. The handwriting was the same, steady, careful, but there was a weight to the words, a quiet finality. If you are reading this, then the sea has done what I asked of it. I used to send these messages without knowing where they might land, or if they would land at all. It was enough to know they were out there, drifting, small pieces of myself set loose on the tide. Then one day, a reply came back. I didn't expect it. I didn't know I was waiting for it, but it changed the shape of my days. You don't need to know who I am, or where I live, or why I began writing. Some things are better kept as shoreline and mist. But know this, your words reached me. They were read on quiet mornings with coffee and rain. They were reread at night when the world felt wide and kind. They reminded me that listening is its own kind of love. I'm not sending any more. The season has turned, and so must I. Thank you for answering. Clara read it slowly, the way one reads something that shouldn't end too soon. When she finished, she didn't cry. She just sat there, her hand resting on the paper, the fire crackling low beside her. The letter didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a closure shaped by gratitude, a tide that had come full circle. That afternoon, the wind rose again, but softly this time. She bundled herself in her coat and walked down to the water's edge. The sky had opened into a faint silvery light, the horizon blurred where sea met air. She took the last empty bottle from her windowsill, the one she'd been saving without quite knowing why. Inside, she slipped a single line written in her calmest hand. I'm listening still. Then she sealed it as she always did and set it afloat. The tide was moving out, gentle and sure. The bottle drifted from her fingers, rocking once, twice, then caught the current and began its long, quiet journey. Clara stood watching until it became a speck on the wide water, then disappeared. When she turned back toward the house, the first light of evening had begun to spread along the horizon, not bright, but soft, like the promise of something continuing just out of sight. She climbed the path slowly, her footprints filling with wind-blown sand. At her window, the row of bottles caught the fading sun and turned it to gold. She thought of Em, somewhere beyond the edge of knowing, and smiled. The sea was breathing its eternal rhythm, coming in, going out, and she felt it inside herself now too. There was peace in that. There was enough.